WOAY TV, and I've been here for about a year. And I originally got interested in weather way back when I was in middle school. And then after I graduated from college, initially I was in television for a couple of years in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and Hagerstown, Maryland, working for the NBC stations. And then I got an operational job in Germantown, Maryland, where we did specific forecasts for different clients. So we did a wide range of forecasts from utility companies all the way up through forecasting for entertainment industry, and we even did some fire weather forecasting at my previous job. And then I came here a year ago to lead the team here at WOAY. So it's nice to be in this area. I'm originally from Merrill, Maryland, which is in the panhandle of Maryland, about 3.5 hours north of here, along the Appalachian spine as well. So used to the mountains and what they have to offer. So it's nice to be in this area, and it's nice to be here giving the presentation for everyone. And we're going to focus on patterns that trigger West Virginia wildfires. And I want to bring to your attention, first of all, we're going to do a little bit of a recap of the Steep Valley fire, which happened back in November, and some of the factors in the weather leading up to this particular fire. Now, if you look here at the rainfall departure from average, this is from the first day in August through the end of October. Here we are in southern West Virginia, and actually the rainfall departure was very close to average, so even a little bit of a surplus. And one of the reasons for that was we had a big outbreak of very heavy rain in early September that triggered that positive anomaly. But what happened after we got beyond early September is we dried out significantly. So if you look at the departure from normal for rainfall from October 1st through October 31st, we got into a bit of a rainfall deficit across the region. So we started out the autumn season on the wet side, but then we quickly dried out as time went on. One significant variable that helps with forecasting the potential for brush fires in this region is called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, or the PDSI. And back in October, the area here in southern West Virginia, we were in a little bit of a negative anomaly. You can see across the upper Mississippi Valley and also the southern plains and lower Mississippi Valley, there was a definite drought developing across that region. And through November, we saw the drought heighten across much of the Mississippi Valley, and southern West Virginia was in a -2 to a -3 with this particular index. And the Palmer Drought Severity Index is important because it measures long-term dryness over an extended period of time, and it's one of the factors that meteorologists use and the Drought Center uses as well.
Are those measurements in inches of rainfall, or are they something a little more subjective?
It's not inches of rainfall.
Okay.
It's more of a subjective number as to, based on this category of moist and wet. So it's a different unit than inches, yeah.
Thank you.
Now out west, of course, you can see there were a pretty positive anomaly in Nevada and parts of California. But basically for the Mississippi Valley East, except for New England, was in a bit of a deficit. And the PDSI in this case was fairly negative. Now, when we look at the Keach-Byram Drought Index, which many folks in the fire industry are used to observing, this is November 7th, so this is right around the time when the Steep Valley fire got going. So it's hard to see on this map, but the negative anomalies, which indicates dryness of topsoil, was in the southern part of the lower Mississippi Valley, parts of Texas, the Southwest, and California. But in our region here, we were a little bit of a positive anomaly. And you see this little negative patch right here? That is across the Shenandoah Valley area. So there were other brush fires besides the Steep Valley fire burning in the Mid-Atlantic. There were several across Virginia in the rain shadow area along Interstate 81, Harrisonburg area. So the Keach-Byram Drought Index did pick up the deficit of rain across that region, but in our region here in southern West Virginia, and I couldn't zoom in any further on this map, but we were in a bit of a positive anomaly. So what that goes to show is that the Palmer drought was a really good indicator of how dry we were compared to the Keach-Byram Drought Index. And I think one of the reasons why is because the Palmer drought takes into account long-term dryness, because we had been dry basically from the end of September all the way through the early parts of November. Now, if you look at the current Palmer Drought Severity Index, much of the Northeast is actually in a pretty favorable spot for being a bit moist, in the West as well. This is the URL where you can find the current Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's updated, I believe, once a week, and it's on the Drought Monitor site that showcases that particular variable. Now, Michelle had given me a list of dates in which the New River Gorge National Park experienced the most brush fires in a season. And these are the years of those brush fires, in which there were a large number of brush fires in this particular region in the national park. So 1978, 1981, 1991, and 2001. And what I have listed here is the rainfall departure from average from October through the end of the year in each of those years. So the running number here was much below average. The driest year being this lowest level line, and then the line above it is the current for that year, rainfall, as you work through the year. The average is the dotted line, and this thick blue line is considered the wettest year. So where we were each year when we had a large number of brush fires in the New River Gorge National Park, it was a very dry year overall. So obviously a deficit of rain contributes to drying out the soil. And then once you get into the spring and fall season, these were a number of brush fires during the fall season. I should specify that, fall season. You lose the leaves on the trees, and then if you have dry soil on top of that, you get these winds blowing through with cold fronts. That dries things out, and that sets the stage for these brush fires. So the common theme is, if you have a dry fall, and especially from late September all the way through November, you don't need red flag warning criteria for the brush fire season to be a bit heightened. So that's what we have learned here, is that rainfall deficits contribute to these brush fires, as well as looking at some of the local brush fire patterns in the autumn. So there's a study out there from, I believe it was NOAA that I looked at, that identified two different patterns across this region that produce the most number of brush fires. Obviously a dry soil, and the soil can dry out pretty easily. And if we have the lack of rainfall in the region leading up to the brush fire season, if you have a high pressure system off the coast, where I'm standing here in this graphic, you get a southeasterly wind in our region. A southeasterly wind is actually a drying, downsloping wind. So it comes off the highest ridges to our east, and it comes down into the New River Gorge National Park. Anytime you have a downsloping wind, it's a drying agent across the region. And if you have an increase in the southeasterly wind, and you have a cold front coming in from the west that has very little in the way of rain, that heightens the risk for brush fires. So that's one particular pattern. Another pattern that contributes to brush fires is a dry cold front that comes through. In other words, this cold front comes in from the Pacific, moves across the country, doesn't have much moisture with it. The fronts that we want to see in the fall would be the fronts that link up with the Gulf of Mexico and bring rain right up the Appalachian spine. But most of the fronts that come through in the autumn season have very little in the way of moisture. You get a dry northwesterly flow behind that front. That is another catalyst for brush fire development in the region. So when we look at this particular regime of a cold front that is crossing through, here's the cold front crossing through the Appalachians. It's moving from west to east. There's very little in the way of moisture with it. It's what's called a kind of a positively tilted trough. Then you get a lot of wind because there's pressure differences along the front that instigate the wind, but you have very little in the way of rainfall. So the overall theme here is that we were in that type of a pattern the day that the Steep Valley brush fire started. This is a surface map from that day. So we had high pressure off to our east. We have a little bit of a gradient. These lines here are isobars, or equal lines of pressure. The tighter they're packed together, the more wind that you're going to have. So in this case, we had a southwest wind, which was a dry wind across the region. We had a cold front that was pushing across the upper Midwest that didn't have much moisture at all with it. And then we had this low pressure off the coast. So we were in one of these patterns that helped to fuel brush fires across the region November 6th. Now, these are the observations from the Beckley Airport, and there's only a couple of airports where we can get these official observations: Beckley, Bluefield, Lewisburg, but Beckley's the closest to where the New River Gorge National Park is. Some of this information is hard to see, but I'll point out that the temperatures that day on November 6th were in the 60s. The dew point was in the 30s, and the relative humidity had dropped down to about 30 to 35%. We had a southwest wind sustained at about 10 to 15 with gusts of 20 miles an hour. We were nowhere near the threshold for red flag warning criteria. As a matter of fact, red flag warnings are hardly ever issued in this area. They're very infrequent, and I'll show you that in a little bit. In order to have red flag warnings, the winds, the sustained winds, have to be much stronger, the gusts have to be stronger, and the relative humidity has to be much lower. So this just goes to show that you don't need red flag warnings for brush fires. All we had here was, in this case, the humidity dropped to 30 to 35%, a little bit of a southwesterly breeze, but even the peak gust in 20 to 25 miles per hour. And then after the brush fire got started, what happened during the overnight period was we saw a big jump in the deterioration of the air quality. So the air quality got considerably bad and actually peaked at its worst early on November 8th. So that's another thing to consider when the fire develops, is that the smoke concentration can get much worse at night. And the reason that happened was we had high pressure built in, and we had the inversion develop. When we get an inversion developed in this area, especially considering where the fire had developed very close to the river valley, that smoke gets trapped. And this is showing the nearest sounding, which is from Blacksburg, Virginia Weather Service. And during the day, we had a decent steep lapse rate. That helps to basically take the smoke and bring it up into the sky and disperse it. But at night, what happens is the temperature, what happens at night is that the temperature actually gets cooler in the valley and warmer aloft, and that traps smoke. So the inversion at night will trap the smoke, and that creates the increase in the pollutants under that inversion. Similar to fireworks, this is kind of relating the smoke to how it works with the fireworks on the 4th of July. In the evening, usually on the 4th of July, you're under a pretty stagnant pattern in the summer. There's usually no major weather fronts coming through or anything like that. So after the smoke from the fireworks, or the fireworks dissipate, you get this stable layer, this inversion, so the smoke actually doesn't go up in the sky, it actually expands across the region where the fireworks were let off. So if you get a stable layer aloft, you're going to get the smoke trapped under the inversion. That's exactly what happened with the Steep Valley fire, and that's why the air quality worsened across the entire region. And what they ended up doing is the Environmental Protection Agency, I believe, added an extra air quality sensor in this area because the air quality got so bad when the Steep Valley fire was going on. And the reason is because we were under this inversion for quite some period of time each day, or each morning, I should say. During the day, the smoke would come up a bit, and the air quality was still bad close to where the fire was burning, but it spread at night, and the air quality got into the red category. And this is a really good depiction, actually, of cross-section of what the Steep Valley area looks like. Now, down at the base, of course, is the river, but this is showing the thermal belt at nighttime when you get that inversion set up. Right at the top of the inversion, which would be very close to the ridge, the highest point on the ridge, close to where the fire was burning, you get the highest temperature and lowest relative humidity. So right at the top of that inversion is where you can see where the fire, if the fire was on the hillside nearby, it could actually spread a bit at night because the temperature is warmer and the humidity is a little bit lower. But otherwise, this does show a good depiction of how having that warmer air aloft would trap the smoke underneath. So instead of the smoke going up and being dispersed upwards, the smoke, once it hits that inversion, it spreads out along the valley floor. And during the day, of course, the fire began on a Monday and the winds were rather breezy, 10 to 20 miles an hour. This is basically showing what the atmosphere looks like during a typical day in the fall season, where the inversion mixes out, so you get a little bit of a lapse rate where the temperature decreases with height. And here's your smoke plume. Here's what happens during the day when you have instability, or the sun creating some convective currents. Obviously the smoke plume moves up, and the smoke can spread during the day. So the stronger the winds are, the better chance that the smoke will travel, and the fire could move along through the New River Gorge National Park. And you don't need that red flag warning criteria, which is gust over 35 or 40 miles an hour, to cause the fire to spread. Now, in the Great Lakes and Northeast, typically in the wintertime, it's cold, there's periods of precipitation, so you generally don't see too many brush fires. It's the spring and the fall season where you get the wind developing, you get the dryness developing, the leaves are off the trees still until the green up period begins. So that's when we have most of our brush fires. In the summertime, we get the leaves on the trees, and what that does is increases the evapotranspiration. That helps to keep a lot of that moisture at the surface, because we have a canopy of leaves and trees that keep the soil a little bit wet. Now, if we get into a drought situation during the summertime, then you can start to see an increase in number of brush fires during the summer season. But this just goes to show the seasonality of fire weather across much of the Great Lakes and Northeast. These are different air masses. So MT is maritime tropical. That's your warm and humid air masses with higher relative humidity. And in the wintertime, you get these pushes of continental polar or continental Arctic air masses, where the dew point drops and the relative humidity drops a good bit, but the clash of air masses produces widespread areas of precipitation. Now, in the Great Lakes and Northeast, we talked about this already, but post-cold front periods where you have a dry northwest wind come in, such as what we're seeing this afternoon. The northwest wind is kicking in behind this cold front. Pre-cold front southwest wind, which is the day that the brush fire initiated at the Steep Valley. We had a southwest wind ahead of a cold front. Temperatures were warm, the ground was dry, so that's another case. And again, that coincides with the Steep Valley fire. And the Bermuda high, so if we're under a Bermuda high, that's typically during the summer when we get days on end with warm and somewhat humid conditions, but no rain. And of course, that contributes to dry soil. So the soil eventually dries out despite the evapotranspiration, or the evaporation of moisture from the leaves on the trees. So that causes that helps to increase the chance for brush fires. What weather pattern stops these fires? Well, what you need is a large storm system, cold frontal passage, stationary front, or a closed low. That will basically end the threat for the brush fire, or help to fully contaminate it and fully extinguish it. So, in the springtime, this is an example of what's called a closed low or a cold front. That's a low pressure that sits over a period for an extended period of time and brings rain each day, and that rain adds up as an event-ending rainfall event. So you get the amount of rain that you normally get in one season within a week, and that would help to stop the brush fires. But you need basically a stalled out system over an area for an extended period of time for that to happen. So a cold front that moves through and then becomes stationary. That is, a cold front moves into West Virginia, it becomes stationary, and then when it becomes stationary, it just sits in the same spot over and over, and you get repeated rounds of rain. That can help. Or if you get a low pressure that's cut off of the jet stream, that low pressure can sit, like for example, this shows April 7th to the 12th of 2002. There was one over the central part of the country. That can contribute to a weather pattern that would completely end the threat for a brush fire. Now, in our region, yes, this does typically happen in the spring where we get these moisture-laden systems, but in the fall season, we get a lot of dry, cold frontal passages. We don't get many fronts that come through and become stationary. What would help in the fall season would be some sort of tropical moisture from a tropical system. That usually does lead to a bit of wind, but we do usually get rain from that. But it's pretty rare for this area to benefit significantly from rainfall from a tropical system. So it's kind of a rare event to have a tropical system come right up the Appalachian spine and bring us 2 or 3 inches of rain. Usually what we need is a weather pattern it usually comes late in the fall season, like late November or December. Now, in the wintertime, leading up to the spring season, the highest elevations obviously have earlier snow season, but the snow melt lasts a lot longer, and so that snow melt contributes to more moisture at the surface. So if we have a winter where we have less than average snowfall, that snowfall is going to melt pretty quickly, so you don't have that additional moisture at the surface. Like last couple of winters around here, we haven't had that much snow. The snow, this past winter came in January, so it melted pretty fast, so we don't have that additional runoff to help keep the soil wet. So in the higher elevations, you're typically like up towards Snowshoe, West Virginia. Those spots will see a shorter snow or a longer snow season, and the brush fire season would be a little bit later and a little bit more abbreviated before the green up period. But in the lower elevations, the snow season starts earlier, there's a little bit less moisture and drier fuels. So we want to have that additional snowpack over the winter when we get these dry periods, because that snowpack helps to conserve some of the moisture in the soil. So if we have a very, very low snowfall year, or much below average, then that can help to dry the soil out more quickly. And also the direction of the aspect or the slope impacts from brush fires. South-facing areas get the sun all day long, so there's more grass than timber. There's higher temperatures, lower relative humidity. Fires can easily start. This is the area where the snow would melt first, the highest rate of spread. For example, if you're driving down the highway and there's slopes to the left and right, like I-64 for example, the slope on your left would be facing north, so there still might be snow on it, but the slope to your right, the snow might be gone from it because it's south facing. West facing gets the sun in the afternoon, so there's fuels mixed. There's latest to heat up and also the latest to cool down. The north facing slopes are the areas that have conserved the most moisture and have the heaviest fuels, but also the lowest relative temperatures and highest relative humidity. And then the east slopes obviously get the sun during the morning time. So this can dictate how your fire can spread. If you have a fire that develops, your south-facing slopes would be more impact for your south-facing slopes, and also the east-facing slopes in the morning, the west-facing slopes in the afternoon, depending on where the fire develops. So these aspects all contribute to how a fire can spread during the day, besides some of the weather patterns. And basically, the steeper the slope, you can have a bigger flame length of the flame, and also it can spread more rapidly, especially when you get those what are called valley winds during the day, where the sun heats the valley quicker than it does the mountains, and you get these kind of microclimates that develop in our area. And some of that fire closer to the base of the river or base of the valley can spread even on just a day with high pressure, because of the microclimates of the area that generate some of those winds. So that's just something to keep in mind. You don't need a cold front necessarily to come through and the winds pick up because of that pressure change to help fuel these fires to spread. Just the normal global patterns in this area with the mountains can help the fire spread. Obviously a little bit less if you just have a valley breeze versus a stronger southwesterly breeze ahead of a cold front, but fires can spread during the day just because of the change in temperature between the valley and the ridge, creating that wind effect. Now, I also looked at red flag warnings because, most folks when they see that say, okay, wow, there's a really big threat for brush fires to develop. I mean, this really stands out to them. This and a fire weather watch are the only two alerts that we have across the country to alert folks of the potential for brush fire. So this is the National Weather Service in Charleston, and the number of red flag warnings issued going all the way back to 2010. So what you see here is there were one this year, two in 2022, two issued in 2023, none in 2021, one in 2020. But that is the entire Charleston jurisdiction. I looked up Fayette and Raleigh County, and there's no record of red flag warnings issued in the last 10 or 15 years. So that just goes to show that the criteria for these alerts to be issued is very specific. And what happens on a day like we've had over the past couple of weeks is the Weather Service will issue these special weather statements. Like this is for today in International Falls. There's a critical fire threat, but it falls under the bulletin of a special weather statement. Just like this bulletin is under the header of a special weather statement, the potential for strong thunderstorms in Oklahoma. This messaging under special weather statements, because they're issued so often, it does get lost, I think, in the public interest, whereas these red flag warnings stand out the most. And there is a push in the Weather Service to get rid of these special weather statements because everything falls under the same bulletin. What they want to do is have specialized alerts with special bulletins that don't necessarily meet the criteria of a red flag warning or a severe thunderstorm warning. So this is one of the ways that the Weather Service is trying to push towards better communication of weather risks to the public. And this is just kind of an example of that. And that's all I had.
Yeah.
At International Falls State, because that's where I grew up.
That's where you grew up? Okay, yeah. Yeah, out there right now, it looks like there's elevated fire risk.
So do the red flag warnings, is it the same criteria across the country? Because I know east and west sort of sides have different internal criteria on what's to watch out for.
Yeah, so the magnitude of the sustained winds and the gust are the same, but what differs is the third criteria that goes into it is the 10 or 100 hour fuel moisture. In the east, they base the criteria on 10-hour fuel moisture, which I think is fuel moisture like brush that burns, which is pretty much what burns in the east is brush. And out west, they base it on 100-hour fuel moisture. And the fuel moisture has to be below, I think, 10%. So if anything below 10%, they would issue it. But it's that third criteria that's different across the country is that 10 versus 100-hour fuel moisture.
And the atmospheric humidity, relative humidity isn't factored into those?
Yeah, actually, yeah, humidity is too. I think it has to be below 20%.
So I know here, like in this area, like below 30 is worrisome.
On our pocket cards, it says 25%.
And then like out west, it's even lower.
Yes.
Yeah.
So does that also vary across the country, or is that just a blanket RH value?
I think the humidity, if it varies, it's maybe by like 5%. It's pretty similar. Yeah.
Is there, I know you said that overall the Weather Service is pushing out more of these special weather statements to try and communicate better. Is there any kind of like a push to look back at previous fires in the region and kind of correlate the facts so you can be like, hey, this is what we've had before. There's potential for this to happen again with this storm front that's coming through or what have you?
No, they would just change up the messaging a bit based on what they're seeing with the humidity and the winds and everything like that. I don't think they would work with the Forest Service to determine that.
Yeah.
They would just basically change a special weather statement each weather statement would be its own bulletin,
Yeah.
for example. And they want to kind of switch out how they message cold weather alerts to and heat alerts. So they're basically going to revamp the whole system of how it works now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Wesley, just to add, that's why checking out your pocket cards for each area that you're going to is so important, because they do take into accounts of their largest fires and stuff like that, and they all have different humidities, they have different, wind speeds, and most of them are very similar, like what Chad is saying, but yeah, that's why you all need to really pay attention to those pocket cards.
I've got a really niche question. I remember hearing sometime in the last 5 years that NOAA was finally upgrading their forecast and prediction capabilities, like the modeling software.
Yeah,
and hardware.
right.
Have you noticed any change with that? Has it gotten more accurate or more chaotic? Or?
Yeah, so they do keep track of there's two big weather models, the GFS, Global Forecast System, and European. We're always competing against the Euro model, because the Euro model has more points ingested into it, so it has a better history of accuracy, but they've made changes to the GFS model, which has actually brought its accuracy up quite a bit. And you can see a running total of its accuracy. What they do is they compare the accuracy of what's called the 500 millibar flow, because the 500 millibar flow basically shows you what's going on in the mid-levels that can dictate what's going on at the surface. So this past winter, for example, there was a point in time where the GFS was actually a little bit better than what the Euro was. But before that, it does fluctuate a bit, but yeah, so NOAA has made changes to the GFS model to make it a little bit more accurate. And they're making upgrades. They're actually developing a new model called the CFS, which takes into account other factors like sea ice. And that's supposed to, I don't know, maybe in 10 years, replace the GFS. And they're also, on top of that, adding artificial intelligence to the models, and they're seeing how that forecasts. But I'll give you an example. There's an AI European model running, and they just started running this a couple months ago, and it was forecasting this huge East Coast snowstorm a couple of weeks ago that never happened. So artificial intelligence has a long ways to go, but the individual upgrades to the model has made it better.
Surprised to hear that it didn't factor in the sea ice albedo thing until recently, but I suppose until the past 20, 30 years, sea ice was really predictable, wasn't it?
Yeah, it does fluctuate a bit. It's been at its lowest point.
Every year for the past 5 years,
Yeah, it's been at a pretty low minimum each year.
Yeah, not factoring that in, the albedo reflection would really throw things off the lower it got, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Now, there's also what's called the North American model, which replaced what's called the Beta model way back in the day. But so the North American model, it's still running, and it's a short-term model, so it comes out first. The model comes out like 11 o'clock in the morning. GFS will come out at noon, 1 o'clock. Euro comes out in the early afternoon. But so the North American model, they haven't made any changes to it in the last 5 years. So it's still running on older equations. But as a meteorologist, I look at that every day too. But I can also know its discrepancies, like where it forecasts too much snow or too much ice. So when a meteorologist knows its biases and knows, okay, I'm not going to show that on the air because it's showing 2 inches of ice, and there's no way in heaven we're going to get 2 inches of ice out of the storm, or wherever the case may be. That's where a meteorologist knowing its biases helps to kind of mold the forecast together. But so there's those 3 major models. Matter of fact, they'll probably do away with the NAM in a couple of years, and it'll just be the GFS and just be the Euro and just be those longer term, which I don't like personally, because I know the biases of the shorter term model, the GFS and the NAM.
You know how to interpret that a little.
Yeah, when this new model comes out, I don't know the biases of this model, so it's going to be kind of like a game for a while to see how it forecasts. But you take into account climatology of the area and so forth. But that's a really good question, because the trend in the industry now is artificial intelligence being added to this. But as we can see from the last couple of weeks, where it was forecasting this big cold outbreak big East Coast snowstorm, and really nothing transpired. They have a long ways to go before artificial intelligence takes over with the forecast models.
It's 5 years old, it'd be like a 5-year-old too. We've got much more time than that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, like trends in weather over your years while you've been doing this?
Yeah.
Are we seeing an increase in fire weather? Like, is it kind of staying the same? Is it just a 10-year cycle, or?
So what I've noticed is that the autumn season seems to be getting drier. That period from about October till Thanksgiving seems to be getting a little bit drier. And the spring season seems to be a little bit wetter overall. The trend in the fall is that tropical systems, which usually we benefit the most from with moisture, once we get into October and November, we're seeing few of those impact the mid-Atlantic per se, like Appalachian region. And that's contributing to the drier conditions. It does appear though that fall is starting a little bit later. So instead of starting in like early September, it's like we get our drier period starting maybe September 15th, 20th. But I think that period from late September through the middle of November is trending a little bit drier than it has been. And the spring season seems to be a little bit wetter than it has been.
Following on to that, with this year being predicted as a fairly heavy hurricane year, is that going to produce more storms that will be able to ride over the Appalachian region and keep this place wetter into the fall? It also was going to be a longer one too, like they might run out of the whole alphabet for the first time.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk right now that there's a lot of factors. First of all, last year we had a combination of El Nino and we had very warm Atlantic temperatures. So the thought process was El Nino drives a lot of wind shear across the Atlantic. So any storm that tries to develop, wind shear would rip apart. We had an above average year for tropical systems last year, and we had an El Nino. So the thought process here is that we have a developing La Nina, which will develop this summer, and it will continue through the fall. La Nina contributes to less wind shear, which would allow these tropical systems that develop off the coast of Africa and the Caribbean, there's different points where they develop, to mold themselves into larger storms. Right now, the main development region in the Atlantic is as warm as it should be.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So it's already there. The thing is, every year you have these. You have the wind blowing off the coast of Africa, leading to Saharan dust. So you can have the perfect conditions, the water temperature is boiling, very little in the way of wind shear, but with that Saharan dust blowing off the coast of Africa, it usually happens every year in June and July. What it does is mitigates the possibility of hurricanes developing because that dust dries the atmosphere out. Yeah, but the overall theme is it will be an active hurricane season, but it's almost impossible to forecast if any of those storms are going to impact our region at this
the
point.
Appalachians are a really good shield from Atlantic conditions.
Yeah, most of those storms either come up towards the East Coast and deflect out to sea, or go into the Gulf of Mexico and go into Texas and stall out a bit before they eventually work their way. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, there is a higher probability that we would be impacted in some way by a tropical system.
Hook that
Yeah.
up here.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems that this area is kind of in a rain shadow effect when it comes to tropical systems, but the Eastern Panhandle is in a better spot because the systems that do come up the East Coast, puts places like Hardy County and Martinsburg area, Panhandle, Harpers Ferry, and an upslope component to the rain. And then that air descends down into this part of the state and it dries out a bit. So we need almost a special track to come right up the Appalachian spine to bring us a lot of rain. Here, Hurricane Hugo is an example of one but that thing ripped through here so fast that I don't think it brought much rain, but it brought a lot of wind. That was back in the 80s.
Anything else, John?
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for coming to talk to us.
Yeah, you're welcome. I love talking weather. And, when I grew up in an area that we had brush fires too, and that I was telling Michelle the other day, there were a couple times when we couldn't go home from school because they had evacuated our area at the mountain. And I remember seeing the smoke and just being very concerned. So, brush fire is a very serious thing, and it's interesting to see, the trends in it. So, it's a very important part of our weather forecast here in West Virginia.